I've gone back and forth about posting this for years. I'm not looking for praise or absolution, and I'm definitely not looking to teach anyone anything. I just need to get it out somewhere anonymous, where it can sit among other bad decisions and half-remembered truths. So here it goes. The substitution of copies for originals in the museum was noticed by no one except me. That sentence has lived rent-free in my head for over a decade. It was the moment I realized I could do something wrong in a very quiet way, and that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. At the time, my name was William, and I was what you'd call adjacent staff at a mid-sized city museum. Not a curator. Not security. I worked in collections support, which is a polite way of saying I handled objects without being important enough to be questioned. I catalogued, moved, logged, and occasionally repaired things that most visitors walked past without reading the plaques. My motive wasn't money, at least not directly. It was resentment mixed with curiosity and a dangerous confidence I didn't know I had yet. I'd spent years watching donors get their names etched onto walls for inheriting taste instead of earning it. I watched priceless objects treated like set dressing, while the people who actually touched them were invisible. The circumstances were mundane, which is what makes this hard to explain. No grand tragedy, no desperate need. Just routine, access, and a growing belief that the system didn't deserve the things it claimed to protect. This is the story of the first time I crossed that line, and the moment I learned how easy it was to disappear something without anyone noticing. Once the idea settled in, it didn't feel like a lightning bolt. It felt like a slow leak. I started noticing systems instead of objects. Who signed what, how often inventories were actually checked, how much everyone trusted the paperwork more than their own eyes. Preparation wasn't a montage of blueprints and dramatic music. It was boredom and patience. I volunteered for extra shifts. I learned which registrars skimmed reports and which ones actually read them. I memorized the cadence of the security guards' rounds, not because they were predictable, but because they were human, prone to distraction, conversation, routine. The most important step was convincing myself I wasn't stealing. Not really. I told myself I was correcting something. The museum already used replicas all the time, copies for display, originals locked away. For preservation. I just planned to reverse the logic quietly. I sourced the copy months in advance through a restoration contact who owed me a favor. Museum-grade replica, artificially aged, weight matched down to the gram. I handled it with gloves even in my apartment, practicing the swap like a nervous magician. In the mirror, I looked ridiculous, careful, reverent, terrified of leaving fingerprints in my own life. The final preparation was mental. I rehearsed excuses I hoped I'd never need. I practiced calm. I practiced boredom. I practiced being the version of myself no one ever looked twice at. By the time the day came, the plan felt less like a crime and more like a task I'd been putting off. That should have been the warning sign. The day itself was aggressively normal. That's the part that still messes with me. No alarms, no dramatic lighting, no sense that the universe knew what I was about to do. The museum smelled like dust and climate control, same as always. I signed in, nodded at people who barely looked up, and went about my routine. My hands knew what to do long before my head caught up. I remember thinking, this is it? This is the moment I ruined my life? It felt smaller than I'd expected, almost disappointing. The object sat where it always did, waiting. I'd handled it dozens of times before, logged its condition, checked its housing. That familiarity was the most dangerous part. It didn't feel sacred anymore, it felt like office equipment. When I made the switch, my heart didn't race the way movies say it should. Instead, everything slowed down. I became hyper-aware of tiny things, the hum of the lights, the faint echo of footsteps somewhere down the hall, the way my gloves squeaked when I adjusted my grip. Every sound felt amplified, like the building was listening. There was one unexpected hitch. Another staffer wandered too close, chatting casually about weekend plans. I smiled, nodded, contributed just enough to seem present while my brain screamed at me to stay normal. They left without noticing anything, and I realized how invisible I really was. When it was done, nothing happened. No sirens. No sudden understanding from the world. I logged the item like I always did and walked away, carrying the weight of what I'd done in a place no one could see. That was the scariest part of all. The crime didn't announce itself. It just blended in. I expected some kind of internal alarm to go off once I stepped away. Guilt, panic, nausea, something definitive. Instead, I felt weirdly hollow, like I just finished a long shift and forgotten why I volunteered for it. The rest of the day crawled. Every email notification made my shoulders tense. Every passing supervisor felt like a spotlight. I kept waiting for someone to say my name in that careful tone people use when they already know. No one did. What unsettled me most was how unchanged everything looked. The museum didn't flinch. Visitors moved through the galleries, pausing, snapping photos, reading placards that now described something that technically wasn't there anymore. I caught myself watching them instead of the object, wondering if anyone could feel the difference. No one could. I went home that night and didn't even check on what I'd taken right away. It stayed wrapped, hidden, like a sleeping animal I was afraid to wake. I ordered takeout, watched something mindless, tried to convince myself it was just another day. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw my own hands making the switch over and over again. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was shallow and crowded with half-dreams about inventories and signatures and someone finally noticing the weight was off by a fraction. I woke up before my alarm, heart racing, already bracing for consequences that hadn't arrived. That was when it hit me. The crime wasn't over just because the act was. I'd created a new version of my life, one where every quiet moment felt like borrowed time. The days that followed were worse than the day itself. Not because anything went wrong, but because nothing did. The absence of consequences started to feel like its own kind of pressure, like the universe was holding its breath. I became obsessed with normalcy. I showed up early. I stayed late. I volunteered for the tedious tasks no one wanted. I laughed at jokes I barely heard. If there was a way to look more harmless, more forgettable, I leaned into it. I wanted to disappear into the background so completely that even my own memory would blur. At the same time, I couldn't stop checking on the thing I'd taken. I'd unwrap it just enough to confirm it was real, solid, unchanged. Sometimes I'd sit on the floor with it, not touching, just staring. It felt heavier at home, like it resented the move. I told myself that was ridiculous, but the feeling stuck. Back at the museum, I found excuses to pass by its display. The replicas sat there obediently, catching the same light, eliciting the same murmurs. No alarms. No whispers. The logs remained clean. I started to understand how people get away with worse things, not because they're brilliant, but because institutions are built on assumption and fatigue. Emotionally, I was split down the middle. Half of me was buzzing, almost euphoric. I'd done something forbidden and survived it. The other half was brittle, flinching at every unexpected sound, convinced I'd already left some invisible trail behind me. The strangest part was the pride. I hated myself for it, but it was there. I'd outsmarted a system that always felt untouchable. And once that thought took root, it became very hard to pull out. About 2 weeks in, the first crack appeared, not where I expected, but in myself. I started overthinking every interaction, replaying conversations in my head like surveillance footage. Did that registrar pause too long when she said my name? Was that security guard actually watching me, or just bored? Objectively, nothing had changed. Practically everything had. I'd crossed some internal boundary, and now my mind treated the world like it was hostile territory. Then came the audit announcement. It was routine, they said. Scheduled months in advance, they said. A partial inventory review, nothing comprehensive. People groaned, complained about paperwork, joked about coffee shortages. I laughed along, feeling my pulse in my throat. The audit wasn't even for my department at first. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made things worse. I kept thinking about margins of error, about how systems only fail when someone looks too closely, or too lazily. I knew exactly how thin the line was. I started justifying everything more aggressively. The original is safer with me. The replica is museum grade. No one's losing anything. This place doesn't care about objects, just appearances. The justification stacked up, flimsy but comforting, like insulation against panic. One afternoon, a coworker mentioned the piece in passing, praising how well it had held up over the years. I felt a jolt of something sharp and hot, fear mixed with a possessive pride I didn't want to examine. I nodded, added a technical comment, and hated how natural it felt to lie by omission. That's when I realized the crime wasn't just the swap. It was the way my thinking had started to bend around it, reshaping itself to keep the secret intact. And once your mind learns how to do that, it doesn't forget. The closest I came to being caught happened on a Tuesday afternoon, which still feels unfair somehow. Tuesdays are supposed to be harmless. I was in the back rooms, working through a stack of condition reports, when my supervisor asked if I could help pull the object for a brief inspection. Not a full review, just a spot check prompted by a donor inquiry. Completely normal. Completely reasonable. Completely devastating. I remember standing up too fast, my chair legs screeching against the floor. My mouth said sure, before my brain could intervene. Inside, everything went quiet, like my thoughts had collectively decided to hide. The walk to storage felt longer than it ever had. I kept waiting for the moment where I'd say something wrong, where my voice would crack, where my face would give me away. But muscle memory took over. I unlocked the case. I followed procedure. I handled the replica with the same care I always had. The inspection itself was excruciating. My supervisor leaned in, commenting on surface details, preservation quality, how well the object had weathered time. Every word felt like a test I hadn't studied for. I answered calmly, technically, pointing out things I knew the copy would pass. And it did. Perfectly. When it was over, my supervisor nodded, satisfied, and thanked me for being thorough. Just like that, the moment evaporated. I stood there alone afterward, hands shaking so badly I had to sit down. That was the first time I understood how fragile the truth really is. Not in some philosophical way, physically fragile. Dependent on context, expectation, trust. The system didn't just allow the lie. It reinforced it. I went home that night and felt sick, not from fear, but from relief. Because a part of me realized I could do this again, and that realization scared me more than almost getting caught ever had. After the almost moment, something in me shifted. You'd think I'd pull back, swear it off, count my blessings. Instead, my fear hardened into logic. Clean, organized, terrifyingly reasonable logic. I stopped thinking of myself as someone who'd committed a crime and started thinking of myself as a temporary custodian. The object wasn't stolen, it was relocated. I told myself museums were just warehouses with better lighting and worse honesty. At least with me, it was seen, appreciated, protected from institutional neglect. I even started framing it as a kind of protest. Quiet, bloodless, intellectual. No broken glass, no ropes cut. Just a substitution no one cared enough to notice. That narrative helped me sleep, or at least lie still with my eyes closed. At work, I became bolder in subtle ways. I spoke up more in meetings. Corrected people. Offered insights I'd previously kept to myself. It felt like I'd unlocked some hidden authority, like knowing the secret truth of the place gave me seniority I hadn't earned. But that confidence came with an edge. I started resenting coworkers for their ignorance, for their casual trust in systems I now saw as hollow. When someone praised the museum's integrity, I felt almost insulted, like they were complimenting a lie I was personally maintaining. At home, the object stopped feeling like a sleeping animal and started feeling like an accomplice. I rearranged my apartment around it, controlled the light, the temperature. Friends commented on how minimal my place looked. I laughed, and change the subject. The scariest part was how normal all of this began to feel. Not exciting. Not dramatic. Just integrated. Like the crime had always been there, waiting for me to notice it. That's when I realized rationalization isn't something you do once. It's a habit. And I was getting very good at it. The consequences didn't come as handcuffs or accusations. They came socially, sideways, in ways I couldn't prepare for. A new conservator joined the museum that fall. Fresh eyes, sharp instincts, the kind of person who actually looked at things instead of just reading reports. She lingered longer in the galleries, asked questions that didn't have obvious answers. I noticed her immediately, and I hated that I did. She spent a lot of time near the display. Too much time. Not suspiciously, professionally. She'd tilt her head, adjust the lighting slightly, make notes. Once, she asked me about the object's provenance in more detail than usual. I gave her the official version, the one I'd recited in my sleep. She nodded, but her expression didn't fully settle. After that, I started seeing patterns everywhere. Conversations would cut off when I entered a room. Emails would go unanswered for a few hours longer than usual. I knew, logically, that most of this was in my head, but paranoia doesn't care about logic. I considered undoing everything. Putting the original back, pretending it had never happened. But the logistics felt impossible now. Any deviation from the established lie would create ripples. The replica had a paper trail. The truth didn't. So I doubled down. I stayed helpful, available, unfailingly polite. I offered to assist the new conservator with research, which felt like inviting a bloodhound into my house and hoping it wouldn't sniff too hard. The irony is, she liked me. Trusted me. That trust felt heavier than fear ever had. That was the unforeseen consequence I hadn't planned for. Once people believe in you, the lie stops being about self-preservation and starts being about betrayal. And that weight is harder to carry than any object. Trust changes the temperature of a room. Once I had it, everything felt warmer and more dangerous. The conservator, let's call her L. Started looping me into projects that had nothing to do with the object. Research assistance, cross-checking old records, pulling comparative pieces from storage. On paper, it was flattering. In reality, it felt like being asked to hold a glass of water perfectly still while someone watched your hands. I became meticulous to the point of obsession. Every email reread twice. Every report triple-checked. I showed up prepared in ways I never had before, not out of pride but out of fear that a single mistake would crack the illusion. The irony wasn't lost on me. The better I performed, the deeper I sank. There were moments, small, sharp ones, where I thought Elle knew. A pause before she spoke. A question asked twice in slightly different ways. Once, she corrected a minor detail about surface wear that the replica technically shouldn't have had. I laughed it off, agreed, adjusted my notes. Inside, I felt something slide loose. At home, the object started to feel less like an accomplice and more like a judge. I stopped unwrapping it. I didn't want to look at it anymore. I'd lie awake thinking about how much effort I was spending to protect a decision that had taken less than 5 minutes to make. The pressure wasn't coming from the museum. It was coming from the role I'd cast myself in, the competent insider, the reliable one, the person who knew things. Maintaining that version of me took constant vigilance, and it was exhausting. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. The crime had given me a kind of identity. And if it ever unraveled, I wasn't just afraid of getting caught. I was afraid of becoming ordinary again. The slip wasn't dramatic. No alarms, no confrontation. Just a sentence that landed wrong. We were in the lab, Elle and I, reviewing documentation for an unrelated piece. She asked an offhand question about long-term environmental exposure, general, academic. I answered automatically, pulling from memory, and halfway through my explanation I realized I'd referenced a condition detail that only applied to the original. The room didn't change, but I did. My stomach dropped so fast it felt physical. I finished the sentence anyway, smoothed it out, added a qualifier that might have covered the inconsistency. L nodded slowly, made a note, and moved on. She didn't call me out. She didn't even look at me differently. That was almost worse. For the rest of the day, I replayed that moment on a loop. Every inflection. Every pause. I couldn't tell if I'd imagined the danger or if I'd just narrowly avoided it. The uncertainty gnawed at me harder than fear ever had. That night, I opened the wrapping again for the first time in weeks. I stared at the object like it might explain itself, like it owed me something. Instead, all I felt was anger, at it, at myself, at the version of me who thought this would stay contained. I realized then that the lie had started to leak. Not outward, not yet, but inward. I couldn't keep track of which details I knew because they were true and which ones I knew because I'd rehearsed them. My own expertise had turned against me. That was the moment I started to understand how this could end. Not with discovery, but with erosion, me slowly giving myself away, one unguarded thought at a time. After the slip, everything felt temporary. Conversations, routines, even my job, it all took on this thin, provisional quality, like I was living in a house scheduled for demolition. I started drafting an exit plan. Not a confession, not an escape, something quieter. I researched how often items were rotated out of display, how long conservation holds lasted, how paperwork could bury a change in plain sight. The idea was simple in theory: return the original during a legitimate transition and let the replica vanish into storage, another footnote no one would chase. But every plan came with risks. Too clean looked suspicious. Too messy looked incompetent. And I'd built my entire safety on being neither. L didn't push. That might have been kindness, or strategy, or nothing at all. But her silence made the decision heavier. I couldn't tell if I was racing a clock or imagining one. At the same time, I felt something else creeping in, relief at the idea of it ending. I was tired. Tired of thinking 3 steps ahead. Tired of monitoring my own thoughts. Tired of the object owning so much space in my life without ever asking for it. I stood in my apartment one night, staring at it again, and realized I didn't know what I wanted anymore. To get away with it? To undo it? To be seen for what I'd done, just so I could stop pretending? That was the real confrontation, not with the museum or my coworkers, but with the version of myself I'd become. And for the first time since the swap, I admitted something I hadn't let myself think before. I couldn't carry this forever. The resolution didn't arrive as a single act of courage. It came in fragments, spread across a week where I barely slept and overperformed at work like I was trying to erase myself. The museum scheduled a routine rotation, nothing headline-worthy. A handful of objects were slated for temporary removal, conservation review, storage reassignment. When I saw the list, my chest tightened. The piece was on it. This was the window I'd been waiting for, even if I hadn't admitted it to myself. I followed protocol to the letter. Too carefully, maybe. I logged times. I asked for witnesses where witnesses were normal to have. I acted exactly like the version of me everyone trusted. When the moment came, in the controlled chaos of carts and forms and signatures, I made the second substitution. Returning the original felt nothing like taking it. There was no thrill, no slowing of time. Just a bone-deep exhaustion and a strange grief, like saying goodbye to something that had ruined you but also kept you company. I took the replica home that night instead of the other way around. Packed it carefully. Not to keep, never that, but to remove it from the equation. A week later, through channels that existed precisely for this kind of quiet disposal, it ceased to be my problem. No one confronted me. No emails followed. The inventory reconciled itself the way it always had, through assumption and momentum. The system absorbed the correction without ever acknowledging the error. I'd gotten away with it. And somehow, that didn't feel like winning at all. Life didn't snap back into place the way I thought it would. If anything, it went slightly out of focus, like my eyes were still adjusting to a darker room. At work, everything continued as normal. The object reappeared in storage, later in the gallery, unchanged to everyone but me. L. Moved on to other projects. Audits concluded. My name stayed clean. The absence of fallout was almost insulting, like the museum refused to acknowledge the version of reality I'd lived in for months. But I felt different in ways that were hard to explain without sounding dramatic. I was calmer, yes, but also flatter. The adrenaline that had fueled me burned off, leaving this quiet awareness of how easily lines can be crossed and uncrossed without ceremony. I'd expected relief. What I got was clarity, and it wasn't comforting. I stopped staying late. Stopped volunteering for everything. I did my job well, but without that sharp edge of performance. Some people read that as maturity. Others read it as disengagement. Both were probably right. At home, the space where the object had lived felt larger than it should have. I didn't fill it. I let it stay empty, a negative space that reminded me what obsession looks like when it finally leaves. The biggest change was internal. I no longer believed in the myth of being caught as the natural end of wrongdoing. Sometimes the ending is quieter. Sometimes you walk away intact, and that's the punishment. You have to live with knowing exactly who you are when no one's watching. I hadn't been exposed. I hadn't been forgiven. I'd simply been revealed to myself. And once you see that version of you clearly, you don't get to unsee it. I'm older now. Not dramatically so, but enough that the version of me who thought this was clever feels like someone I once knew rather than someone I am. I don't work there anymore. I didn't leave in disgrace or triumph, just drifted into something quieter, less adjacent to temptation. What did I learn? That access is power long before it looks like one. That most systems don't fail because of villains, but because of trust layered on top of routine. And that the most dangerous lie you tell is the one that turns you into the hero of your own story. If you're reading this because you recognize the itch, the feeling that you could do something and no one would notice, here's my warning: being unnoticed isn't the same as being untouched. Even if no one ever calls you out, even if the world keeps spinning like nothing happened, you will know. And that knowledge rewires you in ways that aren't obvious until much later. I don't regret returning it. I don't even fully regret taking it. What I regret is how easily I convinced myself that intelligence and care made me exempt from consequences. They didn't. They just delayed them and moved them inward. Some crimes don't end with punishment. They end with understanding. And if you're not ready to meet yourself honestly in the aftermath, without applause, without forgiveness, you're not ready to make the choice in the first place. That's all this is. Not a confession for redemption. Just a record. A reminder that sometimes the only witness is you, and sometimes that's enough to change everything.